They say you can't kill a giant, but sometimes giants kill themselves. In 1996, Kodak was worth $31 billion and employed over 140,000 people worldwide. By 2012, it was bankrupt. This wasn't a story of bad luck or market crashes. This was corporate suicide in slow motion. For nearly a century, the name Kodak was synonymous with capturing life's precious moments. You press the button, we do the rest. That simple promise transformed photography from an elite hobby into something every American family could enjoy. At its peak, Kodak employed over 60,000 people in Rochester, New York alone, turning a modest upstate city into a booming industrial powerhouse. Workers spent entire careers there, raised families on generous wages, sent kids to college on company scholarships, and retired with fat pension checks. The yellow and red Kodak box was as American as apple pie. But here's the twist that makes this story so haunting. Kodak engineers built the world's first digital camera back in 1975, decades before your iPhone existed. They held the future in their hands, but chose to bury it, terrified it would kill their film business. To understand how an empire this powerful could vanish, we need to go back to where it all began, with a poor kid who dropped out of school at 14 and became one of America's greatest inventors. Chapter 1: The Visionary Dropout. George Eastman never planned to change the world. Born in 1854 in Waterville, New York, he grew up dirt poor. When his father died, young George had to make a choice most 14-year-olds never face: stay in school or keep his family from starving. He chose his family. By day, he worked whatever jobs he could find. Eventually, he landed a clerk position at Rochester Savings Bank, pulling in $15 a month, barely enough to survive. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. Work hard, keep your head down, maybe move up to assistant manager someday. But Eastman wasn't most people. In 1877, he planned a trip to Santo Domingo. A colleague suggested he document the journey with photographs, so Eastman bought a camera. Big mistake, or maybe the best mistake of his life. The wet plate photography process was absolutely insane. You couldn't just point and shoot. You had to haul around a tent-sized darkroom, glass plates, and bottles of toxic chemicals. The whole rig weighed as much as a small horse. Eastman took one look at this mess and thought, there's got to be a better way. He never made that trip to Santo Domingo. Instead, he became obsessed. Night after night, he transformed his mother's kitchen into a makeshift laboratory. While she slept upstairs, he mixed chemicals, coated glass plates, and ran experiment after experiment. He devoured British photography journals, teaching himself chemistry and optics. His co-workers thought he'd lost his mind. 3 years of failed attempts, 3 years of burned fingers and ruined batches. Most people would have quit. Eastman kept going. Finally, in 1880, he cracked it. A dry plate formula that actually worked. No more hauling darkroom tents. No more coating plates on location. Photographers could prepare plates in advance and develop them later. It sounds simple now, but back then? Revolutionary. Eastman immediately quit the bank and opened a factory. While other inventors sat on their discoveries, he went straight to mass production. But he wasn't done. Glass plates were still heavy, fragile, and expensive. In 1884, Eastman invented something nobody had seen before: flexible film on a roll. Instead of individual glass plates, photographers could now shoot multiple images without reloading. The implications were staggering. Then came 1888, the year everything changed. Eastman unveiled the first Kodak camera. It was small, simple, and loaded with enough film for 100 shots. The price? $25, roughly $800 in today's money. Suddenly, photography wasn't just for professionals anymore. But here's the genius part. You press the button, we do the rest. Customers didn't need to know chemistry or own a darkroom. They just clicked away, then mailed the entire camera back to Kodak. The company developed the film, printed the photos, reloaded the camera, and shipped everything back. Eastman had invented more than a product. He'd created a business model that would mint money for decades, sell the camera cheap, make a fortune on film and processing. It's the same strategy razor companies use today. Give away the handle. Charge for the blades. Eastman's vision was crystal clear. Put a camera in every American home. Make capturing memories as easy as writing a letter. And it worked. By the early 1900s, Kodak dominated the photography world. The poor kid who dropped out at 14 had built an empire. But empires, as we'll see, can be fragile things, especially when the people running them forget how they were built in the first place. Chapter 2. The Chemical Secret. Success wasn't enough for George Eastman. By the 1890s, his camera business was booming. But he saw a bigger opportunity: film itself. That's where the real money lived. He poured resources into developing a better film formula, one that would leave competitors in the dust. Eastman recruited the sharpest chemists he could find and locked them in laboratories with one mission: create the perfect film. What they invented was cellulose nitrate film, and it was incredible. Crystal clear images, flexible, reliable. There was just one tiny problem. The stuff was basically solid gasoline. It could ignite from a spark, a hot light, even friction. Early movie theaters occasionally burned to the ground because projection booths caught fire, but the image quality? Unmatched. Eastman decided the risk was worth it. In 1891, he made it official, renaming his operation the Eastman Kodak Company. People always asked about that name. Kodak. What did it mean? Absolutely nothing. Eastman made it up. He loved the letter K, thought it sounded strong and memorable. He wanted something short, impossible to mispronounce in any language, and legally trademarkable worldwide. So he sat down with an anagram set and played around until Kodak emerged. No Greek roots, no hidden meaning, just pure marketing genius. With a new name and revolutionary film, Eastman needed a manufacturing base to match his ambitions. In 1892, he broke ground on Kodak Park in Rochester. Calling it ambitious would be an understatement. We're talking 200 acres of industrial complex, 80 hectares of pure production power. Over 200 buildings rose from that land, connected by a private railroad system that moved materials between facilities. Kodak even built its own power plant because the city's electrical grid couldn't handle the demand. This wasn't just a factory, it was a self-contained industrial empire. Inside those buildings, something remarkable happened, and Eastman made damn sure nobody outside knew the details. Manufacturing photographic film required over 50 separate steps, each one precisely calibrated. Mix the chemicals wrong, and you'd ruin entire batches worth thousands of dollars. Get the coating thickness off by a hair, and the film wouldn't work. The complexity gave Kodak a fortress of competitive advantage, but only if the secret stayed secret. Eastman built a security system that would make the Pentagon jealous. The formula was compartmentalized like a Cold War spy operation. Only a handful of senior chemists knew the complete process from start to finish. Everyone else? They knew their piece and nothing more. The guy mixing emulsion in Building 12 had no idea what happened in Building 23. The coating technician never saw the chemistry lab. Eastman engineered it so that even if a worker wanted to steal the formula, they couldn't. They literally didn't know enough. New hires signed confidentiality agreements that lasted until they died. Not until they quit, until they died. Guards patrolled the perimeter around the clock. Visitors needed special clearance just to enter certain buildings. Taking notes inside restricted areas? Forbidden. Cameras? Ironically, not allowed. Former employees reported that Kodak's internal security felt more intense than working at a military installation. But Eastman didn't rely on fear alone. He cultivated fanatical loyalty by treating workers better than any other manufacturer in America. The message was clear: we'll take care of you for life, but you don't betray the family. And it worked. Workers stayed for decades. Whole families built their lives around Kodak employment. The company's secrets stayed locked down tight. By the turn of the century, Eastman Kodak had become the undisputed king of film production worldwide. Competitors couldn't match the quality, couldn't crack the formula, couldn't scale up production the way Kodak could. The empire was complete. But empires built on secrets have a weakness. They become so obsessed with protecting what they have that they can't see what's coming next. Chapter 3. The Golden Age. From 1900 to the mid-1970s, Kodak didn't just dominate the photography industry, it practically owned it. We're talking about market share numbers that would make today's tech monopolies blush. In America, Kodak controlled 85 to 90% of all film sales. Globally, over 70%. When people said film, they meant Kodak the same way people say Kleenex instead of tissue. The company wasn't just successful, it was synonymous with an entire industry. By the 1990s, annual revenue peaked above $10 billion. Profit margins ran so thick that executives joked they were printing money, which wasn't far from the truth considering they literally manufactured the film that captured money being printed. But the real story wasn't happening in boardrooms. It was unfolding in Rochester, New York, where Kodak transformed an ordinary upstate city into something extraordinary. In 1900, Rochester had a population of about 162,000. 50 years later, 332,000. That explosion wasn't random, it was Kodak. The company became the region's economic engine, employer, and identity all rolled into one. People didn't just work at Kodak. Entire family trees grew from those factory floors. By the 1980s, over 60,000 Rochester residents clocked in at Kodak facilities every day. Worldwide employment hit 145,000. To put that in perspective, Kodak employed more people than lived in many American cities. Walk through Rochester during those golden decades, and Kodak's fingerprints covered everything. The company didn't just pay wages, it built the entire community infrastructure. Hospitals, Kodak funded them. Schools, Kodak donated millions. Public parks where kids played, Kodak wrote the checks. George Eastman himself poured a fortune into the Eastman Theater, which became the region's premier performing arts venue. He bankrolled the University of Rochester with donations running into tens of millions of dollars, massive money for that era. The Eastman School of Music emerged as one of America's top conservatories, training world-class musicians, while Kodak workers assembled cameras a few miles away. But here's what really set Kodak apart: how it treated the people who made it all possible. The benefits package was legendary, almost mythical. Starting salary, 30 to 40% above comparable manufacturing jobs. Health insurance covered your entire family. Not just bare-bones coverage, but comprehensive care that rivaled what executives at other companies received. Retirement meant a generous pension that actually let you retire comfortably, not scrape by on Social Security. Every year, Kodak shared profits with employees, not token bonuses, real money tied directly to company performance. Workers got access to company recreation clubs, sports facilities, and social programs. Your kids wanted to go to college? Kodak offered scholarship programs. The implicit deal was ironclad. Work hard, stay loyal, and we'll take care of you from cradle to grave. And Kodak delivered on that promise for generations. 3, sometimes 4 generations of the same family worked at Kodak. Grandfather retired from Building 65. Dad ran quality control in the film division. Son started on the assembly line. Granddaughter joined as a chemist. These weren't just jobs, they were family legacies. Landing a position at Kodak meant you'd won the employment lottery. Friends and neighbors treated new hires with genuine congratulations because everyone understood what it meant: lifetime security. The culture inside those factory walls felt less like a corporation and more like an extended family. Old-timers mentored newcomers, departments competed in friendly softball tournaments. The annual company picnic drew thousands. Workers spoke about Kodak with genuine pride and affection, not the fake corporate cheerleading you see in training videos. There was a saying around Rochester: if you worked for Kodak, you were set for life. And people believed it because it was true, until it wasn't. The relationship between Rochester and Kodak ran deeper than economics. The city's identity merged with the company's success. When Kodak thrived, Rochester thrived. When Kodak innovated, Rochester felt proud. The yellow and red logo became the city's unofficial emblem. Politicians courted Kodak executives. The school calendar accommodated factory shifts. Local businesses oriented their entire operations around Kodak's workforce and payday schedules. You couldn't separate the two. They'd become one entity. Nobody questioned whether this arrangement was sustainable. Why would they? Kodak had dominated for decades and showed no signs of slowing down. Film sales climbed every year. New markets kept opening. Competitors tried and failed to dent Kodak's armor. The future looked like an endless extension of the present, secure, prosperous, unchanging. But that assumption, that certainty of permanence, would prove to be the most dangerous delusion of all. Chapter 4: The Invention They Buried. In 1973, a fresh-faced engineer named Steve Sasson walked into Kodak's research labs. He was 24, straight out of grad school, eager to prove himself at the world's premier imaging company. Sasson had no idea he was about to invent something that would eventually destroy the empire that hired him. A year into the job, his supervisor dropped a curious assignment on his desk. Do something with this CCD chip. CCD, charge-coupled device, was bleeding-edge semiconductor technology that could convert light into electrical signals. Most people saw it as interesting, but impractical. Sasson saw possibility. He disappeared into the lab and started tinkering. December 1975. Sasson emerged with something nobody had ever seen before: the world's first digital camera. And it was gloriously crude. The contraption weighed 8 pounds, about as heavy as a toaster and roughly the same size. It captured images at a whopping 0.01 megapixels, which translates to 10,000 pixels total. Your smartphone today packs 12 million pixels or more. Taking a single photo required 23 seconds of processing time. The image stored on a cassette tape. Yes, a music cassette, and you had to plug the whole mess into a television to see what you'd shot. It was clunky, slow, and produced grainy black and white images. It was also the future. Sasson knew it. He requested a meeting with Kodak's management to demonstrate his creation. Picture the scene: a young engineer, barely a few years into his career, presenting to executives who'd built their fortunes on film chemistry. He showed them the camera, explained the technology, walked them through the implications. The response? That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it. Let that sink in. Kodak had just invented digital photography, and leadership's first instinct was to bury it. Why? The math was brutally simple. Kodak pulled in 85% of its profits from film and the chemicals needed to develop it. Digital photography eliminated film entirely. Management looked at Sasson's invention and saw a bomb that would blow up their $10 billion business model. One executive asked the question that sealed Kodak's fate. Why would we want to cannibalize ourselves? The logic seemed sound at the time. Kodak's leadership convinced themselves of several comfortable lies. First, customers would always prefer physical prints over digital images. People wanted tangible photographs to hold, frame, and put in albums. Second, digital technology was prohibitively expensive and would stay that way. Third, digital image quality would never match film's richness and detail. Fourth, even if digital did catch on, they had at least 10 to 20 years before it threatened the mainstream market. Every single assumption was wrong, but surrounded by yes men in Rochester, insulated by decades of dominance, Kodak's executives believed their own mythology. They made a decision. Keep Sassen's invention quiet, file for patents to protect the intellectual property, but don't commercialize it. Don't even talk about it publicly. Sasson was essentially told to shut up and move on to other projects, and that's exactly what happened. Kodak did maintain a small digital research division in the following years. They weren't completely blind, but the investment was pathetic, less than 5% of R&D budget. Meanwhile, the vast majority of resources continued flowing into incremental film improvements. Faster film, finer grain, better color saturation. Kodak kept perfecting a technology the world was about to abandon. The corporate culture reinforced this delusion at every level. Film is forever. Digital is a fad. Engineers who worked on traditional film stock got promoted. Digital researchers were sidelined, their projects chronically underfunded. Success at Kodak meant protecting the core business, not disrupting it. Innovation became the enemy. Here's the tragic irony. Kodak could have owned digital photography the way they owned film. They had the patent, the engineering talent, the manufacturing capability, the distribution networks, the brand recognition. Everything needed to dominate a new era. But they were too afraid of losing what they had to grab what was coming. This wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of vision and courage. Kodak's leadership chose short-term profits over long-term survival. They picked comfort over adaptation. And in doing so, they committed corporate suicide. It just took 30 years for the body to hit the ground. Steve Sassen's invention, buried in 1975, would eventually rise from the grave to destroy the company that created it. Chapter 5. The Toxic Legacy. While Kodak sold the dream of capturing precious memories, behind those factory walls, they were creating a nightmare. Film photography wasn't just chemistry. It was heavy industrial chemistry on a massive scale. And for decades, Kodak Park functioned as one of America's most toxic manufacturing sites. The list of hazardous chemicals reads like a toxicologist's horror story. Silver nitrate, the key ingredient in photographic emulsion, is corrosive and poisonous. Gelatin derived from animal bones provided the binding medium. Methylene chloride, a known carcinogen, served as a solvent. Volatile organic compounds filled the air. Heavy metals like cadmium and lead played essential roles in film coating processes. We're talking hundreds of different toxic substances flowing through those 200 buildings every single day. The scale of waste was staggering. Manufacturing film generated millions of gallons of contaminated wastewater annually. Chemical-laden air poured from smokestacks. Solid waste containing heavy metals and organic toxins piled up constantly. For the first half of the 20th century, Kodak's solution was brutally simple. Dump it in the Genesee River. That waterway, which flows right through Rochester before emptying into Lake Ontario, became Kodak's personal drainage ditch. By the 1970s, environmental awareness finally forced change. Under mounting pressure from regulators and activists, Kodak built wastewater treatment systems. They installed scrubbers on smokestacks. They created protocols for handling hazardous materials. On paper, everything looked better. In reality, the contamination continued. Systems leaked. Protocols got ignored when production schedules tightened. Accidents happened, and sometimes they got quietly swept under the rug. The Genesee River tells the story in sediment layers. Testing revealed dangerous concentrations of silver, lead, and cadmium embedded in the river bottom. Fish pulled from those waters showed heavy metal contamination levels that made them unsafe to eat. Health officials posted warnings. Don't consume fish caught near Kodak Park. Those warnings remain in effect today, decades after the worst pollution supposedly stopped. The soil contamination at Kodak Park itself was even worse. Dozens of hotspots scattered across the property showed severe chemical contamination. For years, Kodak had buried industrial waste in pits and trenches without proper containment. Toxic sludge seeped into groundwater. Underground chemical plumes spread beyond the factory boundaries. Residential wells near the plant had to be shut down. In 1994, the Environmental Protection Agency dropped the hammer. They designated Kodak Park as a Superfund site, a label reserved for the most dangerously polluted locations in America. This put Kodak on the same list as nuclear weapons facilities and abandoned chemical dumps. The EPA demanded comprehensive cleanup, and the price tag ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Money that could have funded digital camera research instead went to digging up contaminated soil. But the environmental damage was only half the story. The human cost among workers was devastating and largely hidden. Thousands of employees spent entire careers breathing toxic fumes and handling dangerous chemicals. Early safety standards were laughable by today's measures. Workers in coating departments operated without proper respirators. Chemical spills sent people to the hospital. Long-term exposure was treated as just part of the job. The health statistics told a grim tale. Cancer rates among certain departments ran significantly higher than the general population. Respiratory diseases plagued workers who'd spent decades in poorly ventilated buildings. Skin conditions from chemical contact were common. As the evidence mounted, lawsuits started piling up. Former employees sued Kodak, claiming occupational diseases from toxic exposure. Listen to the workers themselves, and the stories get haunting. "We didn't know what we were breathing," one retired coating technician recalled. "The air was thick with chemical smell. Your eyes watered. Your throat burned. But that was normal. That was just how it was." Another worker described watching colleagues develop mysterious illnesses, cancers that seemed to cluster in specific buildings and departments. Kodak's response followed the corporate playbook: deny, minimize, delay. When confronted with health concerns, management pointed to safety regulations they claimed to follow. When pressed about specific cases, they argued that individual illnesses couldn't be definitively linked to workplace exposure. When lawsuits forced their hand, they settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. The company did establish compensation programs for some occupational diseases, but workers described the process as deliberately difficult and stingy. The environmental legacy persists. Rochester is still dealing with Kodak's pollution today, long after the company's collapse. Cleanup continues at multiple sites, monitoring wells track contamination plumes. Restrictions remain on land use in affected areas. The company that promised to help people preserve beautiful memories left behind a landscape poisoned for generations. Here's the bitter irony. All that toxic waste came from manufacturing film, the very product Kodak refused to abandon even as digital technology offered a cleaner alternative. They clung to their chemical empire while poisoning their own workers and hometown. The yellow and red Kodak box symbolized happy memories. The factories that made those boxes symbolized something much darker. Chapter 6. The competitors' strike. The 1980s brought the first real cracks in Kodak's armor, and they came from an unexpected direction: Japan. Fujifilm had been a minor player, mostly confined to Asian markets. Then they decided to invade America, and they came loaded for bear. Fuji's film matched Kodak's quality shot for shot. The colors actually popped more: brighter, more saturated, particularly appealing for vacation photos. And the kicker? Fuji priced their film 20 to 30% cheaper than Kodak. For consumers buying film by the roll, that difference added up fast. Fuji didn't just compete on price and quality, they played the marketing game aggressively. Which brings us to 1984, and one of the most humiliating moments in Kodak's history, the Los Angeles Olympics. The Summer Games were happening in Kodak's backyard, on American soil. Kodak had long associated itself with capturing important moments. They should have owned Olympic sponsorship. Instead, Fuji swooped in and became the official film sponsor. Imagine Kodak executives watching Fuji's green and red logo plastered across venues in Los Angeles while billions of viewers worldwide tuned in. It was a gut punch. Kodak's response revealed everything wrong with the company's mindset. Instead of improving their product or competing harder, they cried foul. Kodak accused Fuji of dumping, selling below cost to grab market share. They filed complaints with the U.S. government, demanding trade protection. They wanted Washington to fight their battle, instead of fighting it themselves. The complaints went nowhere. Meanwhile, Fuji kept gaining ground. The assault came from multiple fronts. Canon and Nikon were building superior camera bodies that made Kodak's offerings look outdated. Konica squeezed margins in Asia. Agfa pushed into Europe. Kodak's fortress walls were crumbling, and competitors were pouring through the gaps. But the real earthquake was still building underground. The 1990s brought digital technology out of the lab and into the market. Ironically, Kodak fired the first shot. In 1991, they released the DCS-100, a professional digital camera. Price tag, $13,000. It was a beast. A Nikon film camera body bolted to a separate digital storage unit you wore on a shoulder strap. Only photojournalists and wealthy professionals could justify the cost. Kodak treated it as a niche product, not the beginning of a revolution. Meanwhile, Sony released the Mavica. Aimed at regular consumers, Apple jumped in with the Quick Take. Casio launched the QV10. These early digital cameras were crude. Low resolution, limited storage, clunky interfaces, but they worked. And they were getting better rapidly. More importantly, they didn't need film. Every digital photo was another nail in Kodak's coffin, and the hammering was just beginning. Then came 1994 and 1995, when the internet exploded into mainstream consciousness. Suddenly, digital images had a purpose beyond just avoiding film costs. You could email photos to relatives across the country instantly. Early social networks let people share images online. Digital cameras and internet connectivity formed a perfect match. Younger consumers, already comfortable with computers, embraced digital photography enthusiastically. They didn't care about film's supposed superiority. They wanted convenience and connectivity. Canon, Nikon, and Sony saw where things were headed and went all in on digital development. They poured resources into sensor technology, image processing, and user interfaces. They understood that whoever dominated digital photography would control the industry's future. Kodak understood this too, theoretically, but understanding and acting are different things. Inside Kodak, the old guard still ran the show. Digital will never replace film quality. They repeated this mantra like a religious conviction. People want prints, not pixels. They genuinely believed consumers would always prefer physical photographs, so investment kept flowing primarily into incremental film improvements while digital research scraped by on table scraps. By 1999 and 2000, the digital camera market hit critical mass. Prices dropped to $500 to $1,000 for decent models. Megapixel counts climbed rapidly. Image quality improved with each generation. Regular consumers started buying digital cameras in serious numbers. The film market didn't collapse overnight. It started bleeding slowly, steadily, unstoppably. Watch Kodak's film market share tell the story. 70% in 1995, 60% by 2000, down to 40% by 2005. From 2000 onward, film revenue declined 10 to 15% annually. The trajectory was unmistakable. Anyone looking at the numbers could see Kodak's core business dying. But admitting that required confronting an unthinkable reality. The company's internal culture made adaptation nearly impossible. Film engineers were royalty, respected, well-paid, promoted into leadership. Digital engineers were second-class citizens working on side projects leadership barely took seriously. Decisions crawled through layers of bureaucracy. Risk aversion ruled. "We've always done it this way" wasn't just a phrase, it was embedded in institutional DNA. Look at the leadership team, and the problem becomes obvious. These were men who'd built their entire careers on film chemistry. They'd risen through ranks by optimizing film production. Their expertise, their achievements, their identities were all tied to film technology. Psychologically, they couldn't accept that their life's work was becoming obsolete. So they didn't. They kept believing that film's superior quality would win out, that digital was a temporary fad, that consumers would come to their senses. By the time Kodak's executives finally acknowledged the threat, they were years behind competitors who'd been sprinting toward digital while Kodak jogged. The company that invented digital photography had let Sony, Canon, and Nikon seize the future. Kodak was still trying to perfect the past while the world moved on without them. The empire was crumbling, and the people in charge were too proud, too scared, or too deluded to stop it. Chapter 7. The desperate fight between 2000 and 2003, Kodak finally woke up to reality. Leadership announced they were going all in on digital. Press releases promised transformation. Executives talked about reinventing the company for the digital age. There was just one problem. They were half a decade too late. And in technology, that's an eternity. Kodak's digital strategy looked good on PowerPoint slides. They launched the EasyShare line of digital cameras, user-friendly models aimed at mainstream consumers. They built a network of photo kiosks in drugstores and retail shops where people could print digital images. They created Kodak Gallery, an online service for sharing and ordering prints. They went on an acquisition spree, buying tech companies at premium prices to gain digital expertise fast. But every move ran into brutal market realities. By the time EasyShare cameras hit shelves, Canon, Nikon, and Sony had already established dominant positions. Those companies had spent years refining digital technology while Kodak dawdled. They had brand loyalty among digital customers. They had superior sensors, better image processing, and slicker user interfaces. Kodak was bringing a knife to a gunfight. The economics were punishing. Digital camera development required massive R&D investment, but margins were razor thin compared to film. Kodak was hemorrhaging cash, trying to catch up technologically, while their profitable film business evaporated. They were running faster and faster just to fall further behind. In 2003 and 2004, reality forced hard decisions. Kodak announced its first major layoffs, 15,000 jobs globally. Rochester took the biggest hit, 4,000 to 5,000 positions eliminated. Manufacturing plants closed. Research labs shut down. Buildings that had hummed with activity for decades went dark and silent. The psychological impact on Rochester was devastating. For generations, Kodak had been the rock, stable, permanent, forever. Lifetime employment wasn't just a promise. It was the bedrock of the local economy and culture. Now suddenly, people were getting pink slips. Families where 3 or 4 generations had worked at Kodak watched that legacy collapse. Workers in their 50s and 60s, who'd expected to retire from Kodak with full pensions, found themselves unemployed with limited prospects. Then, 2005 brought a new threat nobody saw coming: camera phones. Nokia and Samsung started putting decent cameras into mobile phones. Why carry a separate device when your phone could snap pictures? The compact digital camera market, the very segment Kodak was desperately trying to dominate, started its own death spiral. 2007 delivered the killing blow, the iPhone. Apple's device wasn't just a phone with a camera bolted on. It was an integrated ecosystem where taking photos, viewing them, editing them, and sharing them happened seamlessly. Instagram would launch 3 years later and prove that smartphone photography wasn't just convenient, it was culturally transformative. Young people stopped buying dedicated cameras entirely. The devices went straight from pocket to cloud to social media. Who needed an easy share camera when your iPhone did everything better? Kodak had no answer. They had no smartphone technology, no mobile software expertise, no ecosystem. Their easy share cameras suddenly looked hopelessly outdated, clunky gadgets from a bygone era. Kodak couldn't compete on price because Asian manufacturers had lower costs. They couldn't compete on features because they lacked the technology. They couldn't compete on convenience because smartphones lived in your pocket. The game was over and Kodak had lost. The layoffs became relentless. In 2007, another 3,000 jobs gone. In 2008, 4,500 more cuts. In 2009, 3,500 additional layoffs. By 2011, Kodak's global workforce had collapsed from 145,000 to just 17,000. In Rochester, employment dropped from 60,000 to roughly 7,000. Those aren't just statistics. Each number represents a family's security destroyed, a career ended, a future canceled. Kodak Park became a ghost town. Buildings that once operated around the clock stood empty. Equipment rusted. Parking lots that used to overflow with workers' cars grew weeds through cracked asphalt. The company started selling off properties and assets just to raise cash. The empire was being liquidated piece by piece. The financial statements told a story of freefall: 2005, loss of $136 billion, 2007, loss of $676 million, 2011, loss of $258 million, revenue cratering, cash reserves depleting, debt mounting. Wall Street watched Kodak circle the drain. The stock price, which had peaked near $90 in the 1990s, fell below $2. The company's market value evaporated. CEOs rotated through like relief pitchers in a blowout game. Each new leader promised a turnaround strategy. None of them could stop the bleeding. The problems were too deep, the competition too far ahead, the market too transformed. Kodak was trying to save a business model that had already died. In desperation, Kodak tried selling its patent portfolio. They sat on valuable intellectual property from decades of imaging research, including those original digital camera patents from the 1970s. Executives negotiated with tech giants like Google and Apple, hoping to raise billions by licensing or selling IP. The sales happened, but the money wasn't nearly enough to save the company. Meanwhile, Rochester was dying along with Kodak. Unemployment spiked as thousands of workers hit the job market simultaneously. Housing prices collapsed. Who wanted to buy a home in a city losing its economic foundation? Small businesses that had served Kodak workers for generations closed their doors. Restaurants, dry cleaners, car dealerships, shops, all gone. The city's tax base imploded. Schools faced budget cuts. Infrastructure deteriorated. The ripple effects spread through every corner of community life. You could see it in people's faces around Rochester. The shock, the betrayal, the fear. These weren't workers who'd slacked off or failed. They'd done everything right. They'd been loyal. They'd worked hard. They'd believed in the company, and it didn't matter. The world had changed. Kodak had failed to change with it, and now regular people were paying the price for executive incompetence. The city that Kodak built was crumbling, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Chapter 8: The Fall of an Empire. January 19, 2012. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The news hit like a thunderclap. Major outlets ran the story as front-page news. An American industrial icon had fallen. For people old enough to remember when Kodak dominated photography, it felt surreal. This was supposed to be impossible. Kodak was permanent. Kodak was America, and now Kodak was broke. The numbers were staggering. Kodak carried $6.75 billion in debt against just $5.1 billion in assets, underwater by over $1.5 billion. Global employment had shrunk to 17,000 workers from a peak of 145,000. In Rochester, only 6,500 employees remained from the 60,000 who once clocked in daily. Market capitalization sat below $200 million. In 1997, just 15 years earlier, Kodak had been worth $31 billion. The company had lost over 99% of its value. Bankruptcy triggered immediate carnage. Kodak shut down its entire consumer camera division. The EasyShare line, everything. They stopped manufacturing consumer film, ending over a century of production. Another 8,000 layoffs hit immediately. The company began liquidating assets to pay creditors and fund restructuring. The patent portfolio became the prize asset. Kodak auctioned off its intellectual property to a consortium of tech companies for $525 million. Apple, Google, Facebook, Samsung, the very companies that had killed Kodak's business, bought the patents that could have made Kodak one of them. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. Everything went on the auction block. The personalized imaging division sold. Document imaging business sold. Kodak Gallery, the online photo service, shut down and sold for parts. Factory buildings, specialized equipment, real estate holdings, all liquidated. Kodak was being dismantled and sold off piece by piece like a car in a junkyard. But the cruelest blow fell on retirees. 56,000 people who'd spent careers at Kodak, who'd retired with promises of secure pensions, suddenly faced massive benefit cuts. Many lost 30 to 40% of their retirement income overnight. These were folks in their 70s and 80s who'd planned their retirements around those Kodak pensions. "We worked our whole lives for this company," one retiree told reporters, voice breaking. "They promised to take care of us." The promises meant nothing in bankruptcy court. Stories emerged of retired workers in their 70s looking for jobs. People who'd put in 30, 40 years at Kodak, who thought they'd earned dignified retirements, were applying at grocery stores and retail shops. Some had to sell their homes. Others moved in with their kids. The social contract, work hard, stay loyal, retire secure, had been shredded. Rochester absorbed body blow after body blow. Regional unemployment hit 9 to 10%, well above national averages. When you counted indirect job losses, suppliers, service businesses, related industries, over 50,000 jobs vanished from the local economy. The population told the story. 332,000 residents in 1950, down to 210,000 by 2012. The city was hollowing out. Real estate values cratered. Houses lost 40 to 50% of their value. Entire neighborhoods emptied out as people fled for opportunities elsewhere. Blocks that had been solidly middle class turned into ghost towns. Homes sat abandoned, windows boarded up, lawns gone to seed. The blight spread like a virus. Small businesses that had served Kodak workers for generations closed their doors forever. The restaurant where engineers grabbed lunch, gone. The print shop that handled Kodak overflow work, bankrupt. The clothing store where workers bought professional attire, shuttered. Each closure triggered more job losses, more economic contraction, a death spiral feeding on itself. Schools faced devastating cuts, as property tax revenues collapsed. Class sizes ballooned. Programs got eliminated. Teachers were laid off. The city government hemorrhaged revenue, forcing cuts to police, fire, infrastructure maintenance, and social services right when the community needed them most. The human stories behind the statistics were heartbreaking. A chemical engineer with 30 years of experience at Kodak couldn't find work. His specialized knowledge was obsolete, and he was considered too old to retrain. A family where grandfather, father, and son had all worked at Kodak found themselves all unemployed simultaneously. 3 generations cut down together. A retired machinist who'd worked at Kodak for 42 years lost enough pension income that he had to sell the house he'd lived in for decades. "Kodak was my whole life," he said. "Now it's gone, and I don't know who I am anymore." The psychological damage ran deeper than financial losses. Rochester had believed in stability, loyalty, and the promise of secure employment. An entire generation had built life plans around the assumption that Kodak would always be there. That belief system collapsed. Young people graduating from Rochester schools looked around and saw no future. The talented ones left for cities with growing economies. The brain drain accelerated. Exactly the people Rochester needed to rebuild were the ones fleeing fastest. The city's identity crisis was profound. For over a century, Rochester meant Kodak. The company had shaped the city's culture, economy, and self-image. What was Rochester without Kodak? Nobody knew. The loss felt less like a business failure and more like a death in the family. In September 2013, Kodak emerged from bankruptcy as a drastically smaller company. They'd restructured around commercial printing, packaging solutions, and specialty film for industrial and Hollywood use. The consumer photography empire was dead. Global employment stood at roughly 8,000. Rochester had maybe 2,000 to 3,000 Kodak workers left, a rounding error compared to the glory days. This wasn't the Kodak that George Eastman built. It wasn't even a shadow of that company. It was a corporate zombie. Technically alive, but stripped of everything that had made it significant. The yellow and red logo remained, but it was an empty symbol. The empire had fallen, and what crawled out of the ruins barely deserved the name. Chapter 9. The Ghost Factories drive through Kodak Park today, and you're touring a graveyard. 200 buildings still stand across that massive industrial complex, but more than half sit completely abandoned. Windows are shattered, glass crunching under your feet if you're foolish enough to get close. Paint peels from concrete walls in long, sad strips. Inside the buildings, machinery rusts silently. Giant coating machines, chemical processors, poisoned conveyor systems frozen mid-operation like the industrial equivalent of Pompeii. Outside, weeds push through cracked pavement, nature slowly reclaiming what was once the beating heart of American manufacturing. Building 9 haunts me particularly. This was the research and development center where Kodak's brightest minds worked on the future. Somewhere in those dark, empty rooms, Steve Sasson built the first digital camera in 1975. The device that could have saved Kodak was invented right there, then buried by executives too scared to embrace change. Now Building 9 stands hollow and silent, a monument to squandered opportunity. The labs are stripped bare. Broken glass litters the floors. Pigeons roost where million-dollar equipment once hummed. If buildings could feel irony, this one would be screaming. In 2013, Kodak sold off most of Kodak Park to a real estate company that rebranded it as Eastman Business Park. The new owners pitched it as a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. Come rent space in the facility that once dominated global imaging. About 50 to 60 companies have taken them up on it. Small tech startups, logistics firms, light manufacturing operations. They occupy maybe a third of the available space. The rest sits empty. And it's hard to imagine what could possibly fill it. You can't just conjure 60,000 jobs out of thin air. Some buildings remain in active use. Kodak still operates a few commercial printing facilities there, producing packaging and business materials. They manufacture specialized film for medical imaging and motion pictures. Hollywood still shoots on film for certain productions. A handful of tech companies have set up shop trying to leverage Rochester's legacy in optics and imaging. But walk through Eastman Business Park and you feel the emptiness. Vast parking lots that once overflowed with workers' cars now have a few dozen vehicles scattered across acres of asphalt. Buildings that ran 3 shifts 24/7 now sit dark most hours. The abandoned sections attract urban explorers, people who photograph decay and ruin. They slip through broken fences, dodge security, and document the collapse. Photos circulate online: rusted chemical tanks, collapsed ceilings, graffiti sprayed across walls where motivational posters once hung. Kodak died here. Someone spray-painted in massive letters. Kodak Park has become an icon of Rust Belt decline, shared alongside photos of Detroit's abandoned auto plants and Pittsburgh's dead steel mills. It's disaster tourism, and Kodak is the main attraction. Other Kodak landmarks around Rochester tell the same story. The Kodak office building downtown still stands, a mid-century tower that once bustled with executives and administrators. Now it's maybe 2/3 empty. Kodak Tower, which used to dominate the skyline with the company's logo glowing in yellow and red, is about 1/3 vacant. The logo still lights up at night, but it feels more like a ghost haunting the city than a symbol of pride. The George Eastman Museum operates out of Eastman's former mansion, a gorgeous estate he built at the height of his success. It houses photography exhibits and the world's oldest photography collection. On paper, it's a significant cultural institution. In practice, it's quietly mourning an industry that died. Tourists rarely visit. The exhibits feel like archaeological displays of an extinct civilization. Compare photographs from the 1960s and 70s with today, and the contrast is devastating. Archive images show Kodak Park alive. Workers streaming through gates at shift change, parking lots jammed with cars, smoke rising from stacks as production ran around the clock. The aerial shots show a thriving industrial ecosystem, every building lit and active. Contemporary photos show the same location silent and abandoned. Empty lots, dark buildings, no smoke, no workers, no life. It's the visual definition of decline. Traces of former glory persist like archaeological fragments. The faded Kodak logo, yellow and red, once so vibrant, barely visible on building facades. Old directional signs pointing to departments that no longer exist. Film finishing, chemical mixing, quality control. Railroad tracks that connected the facilities now rust unused, weeds growing between the ties. Pipes and electrical conduits snake between buildings, carrying nothing, serving no purpose except as monuments to what was. Rochester residents drive past these ruins regularly, and it affects them. It's like visiting a grave, one former worker told me. People who spent careers there feel genuine grief seeing the decay. Parents who brought their kids to company picnics, who felt pride working for Kodak, now look at the abandoned buildings and feel something between sadness and anger. The physical ruins are bad enough. The psychological impact cuts deeper. The city wants to demolish some of the most dangerous structures, but demolition costs millions, and Rochester is broke. The buildings need environmental remediation before they can be torn down. Decades of chemical contamination don't just disappear. Some officials have floated plans to convert certain buildings into apartments, artist lofts, or studios. A few small projects have actually happened, but the scale of redevelopment needed dwarfs available resources. Mostly, the buildings just sit there, slowly falling apart. Not everything is dead. The Eastman Theater still operates as a premier performing arts venue. The Rochester Philharmonic performs there regularly. Eastman School of Music remains one of America's top conservatories, training world-class musicians. These institutions survived because George Eastman endowed them so heavily that they became independent of the company. They're Eastman's lasting positive legacy, proof that he genuinely cared about culture and community, not just profits. But here's the painful irony. Rochester still calls itself the Image City. The nickname appears on welcome signs, city branding, and promotional materials. Image City, because this was where imaging technology was born, where the photography industry thrived. Except the imaging empire collapsed. The factories are ruins. The company is a shadow. The name is a ghost, haunting a city that doesn't know how to let go of its past. Walking through Kodak Park today feels like exploring the ruins of a fallen civilization. You can still see the grandeur in the architecture, the ambition in the scale, the innovation in the specialized buildings designed for specific manufacturing processes. But it's all dead now. The empire that George Eastman built, that employed generations of Rochester families, that defined an entire city's identity, it's gone. And what remains are these massive empty buildings, slowly crumbling into the ground, monuments to what happens when companies stop adapting and start dying. Chapter 10. The Lesson. Kodak still exists today, technically. The company employs roughly 4,500 people globally, down from 145,000 at its peak. 2023 revenue came in around $1.2 billion, a fraction of the $10 billion plus they pulled in during their glory years. They're not on the S&P 500 anymore. Most people under 30 have never heard of them. The Kodak that matters, the Kodak that shaped American culture and industry, that company is dead. What remains is essentially a footnote operating under a famous name. Today's Kodak focuses on commercial printing, helping businesses produce marketing materials and packaging. They manufacture specialty films for medical imaging, scientific research, and Hollywood productions. Directors like Christopher Nolan and Quentin Tarantino still shoot on film, creating a small market Kodak serves. They license out some remaining patents. It's a viable business, but it's insignificant compared to what they were. Kodak went from defining an industry to occupying a narrow niche. There's a small irony worth mentioning. Film photography has experienced a minor renaissance among Gen Z. Young people who grew up with digital have discovered the aesthetic charm of analog film. Kodak restarted production on certain film stocks to meet this demand. But let's be clear, this is a boutique market, a nostalgia-driven hobby for enthusiasts. It's not a business foundation. It can't support thousands of workers or revive Rochester's economy. It's like selling vinyl records in the streaming era. Cool, but not commercially significant. The lessons from Kodak's collapse are brutal and clear. This is the textbook case of the innovator's dilemma, when successful companies fail because they're too afraid to disrupt themselves. Kodak invented digital photography but refused to commercialize it because they feared killing their film business. They chose to protect their current profits over investing in their future. The tragic outcome? They lost both. Film died anyway, and competitors seized the digital market Kodak could have owned. Corporate culture killed Kodak as surely as any competitor. Decades of dominance bred complacency and arrogance. Success became the enemy of adaptation. When the market shifted, Kodak's leadership refused to accept reality. Their bureaucratic decision-making moved at a glacial pace while competitors sprinted ahead. They dismissed early digital cameras as toys, underestimated Asian manufacturers, and assumed customer loyalty would last forever. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The leadership failure was profound. CEOs lacked the vision to see beyond quarterly earnings. Board members had built entire careers on film chemistry. Psychologically, they couldn't accept that their life's work was obsolete. Nobody had the courage to make the painful but necessary choice. Cannibalize film, go all in on digital, accept short-term losses for long-term survival. Instead, they chose comfort over disruption. certainty over risk, the past over the future. That choice killed the company. And Kodak isn't alone. This same story has played out repeatedly. Blockbuster dismissed Netflix as a niche mail-order service and missed the streaming revolution. Nokia dominated mobile phones, but couldn't adapt when smartphones transformed the industry. Borders bookstores ignored e-commerce while Amazon built an empire. Sears invented mail-order retail, but couldn't transition to online shopping. The pattern repeats. Dominant companies get disrupted by innovations they fail to embrace. The names change, but the story stays the same. Refuse to innovate, and you die. Rochester has learned to survive without Kodak, but it hasn't thrived. The city has worked hard to diversify its economy, attracting healthcare companies, tech firms, and educational institutions. The University of Rochester is now the region's largest employer. Xerox and Bausch plus Lomb still maintain operations there. A small startup scene has emerged, particularly in optics and imaging technology, entrepreneurs trying to build on Rochester's legacy, but nothing has replaced what Kodak was. Nothing could. The population numbers tell the story. Rochester peaked at 332,000 residents in 1950. Today it's around 205,000 and still declining. The city struggles with high poverty rates, abandoned housing, underfunded schools, and brain drain as young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. These aren't just statistics. They represent a community that lost its economic foundation and hasn't fully recovered. But there are glimmers of hope. Downtown Rochester has seen some redevelopment. New restaurants, converted lofts, small business growth. The Optics Valley initiative tries to leverage Rochester's imaging expertise, creating a cluster of optics and photonics companies. Entrepreneurs are attempting to build new industries on the foundation Kodak left behind. It's slow, painful work, and the city may never return to its former prosperity. But Rochester is fighting to reinvent itself, to find an identity beyond Kodak. Kodak's legacy is dual-edged. On one side, there's genuine glory. George Eastman democratized photography, making it accessible to ordinary people. He created an entire industry. You press the button, we do the rest genuinely changed how humans capture and preserve memories. That innovation mattered and still resonates. On the other side, there's the cautionary tale. Past success guarantees nothing about the future. Refusing to change means death. Markets don't care about legacy or loyalty, adapt or disappear. The haunting what if remains. What if Kodak had commercialized digital photography in 1975 when Steve Sasson invented it? Could they have become the Apple or Samsung of imaging? Would Rochester be a technology hub rivaling Silicon Valley? Could 60,000 jobs have been saved? We'll never know, but the alternative timeline where Kodak embraced its own invention instead of burying it, that's the dream that makes the real outcome hurt even more. Kodak was the American dream incarnate. George Eastman rose from poverty to build an empire. He created jobs, wealth, and opportunity. He gave back to his community through philanthropy that still impacts Rochester today. You press the button, we do the rest, was more than marketing. It was a promise that technology could serve ordinary people. For generations, that promise held. But the story ends in tragedy. From a $31 billion empire to a $1 billion niche player. From 145,000 employees to 4,500. From a cultural icon that defined photography to a cautionary tale in business school case studies. Kodak went from symbol of innovation to warning about complacency, from driver of American manufacturing to victim of creative destruction. The final message is stark and unavoidable. In technology and business, nothing lasts forever. Markets shift, technologies evolve, customer preferences change, Companies that don't adapt get swept away, no matter how dominant they once were. Kodak invented the future, literally held it in their hands in 1975, and chose to bury it out of fear. That decision, that failure of courage and vision, destroyed not just a company, but an entire city's way of life. This is the dark story of America's photography empire. Brilliant innovation that birthed an industry, decades of dominance that bred arrogance, a revolutionary invention buried by fear, competitors who seized the future while Kodak clung to the past, and ultimately, the spectacular collapse of an icon. Kodak didn't fail because they lacked talent or resources. They failed because they stopped being what made them great in the first place. They stopped innovating. And in the end, the empire that George Eastman built from nothing returned to dust, leaving behind empty factories, broken promises, and a lesson the business world will study for generations. Innovate or die. There is no third option.